colleague of mine basically had sent YouTube an intelligence report, a detailed one, that mentioned Israr Ahmad, and he is a radical preacher, a radical Islamist preacher. And this content was flagged in terms of how it's used to basically incite anti-Semitism. And I'm talking about the most blatant kind of anti-Semitism. So, Jew world order, Jews are conspiring to rule the planet. He uses very dehumanizing language. Yes, it's very, very, like I said, very blatant. There's no gray here. And they received this report on the 28th of October, 2021. They made the decision not to remove it. Sadly, most of the content that was flagged in that intelligence report was not removed, including, again, very blatant anti-Semitic content. Now, his channel, his YouTube channel, has only been growing. Within the past 2 weeks, it gained thousands, tens of thousands of subscribers, which is really quite horrific. You're allowing people to be radicalized. You're allowing people to have their convictions that Jews are evil, are horrible, to be reinforced. After every attack, after every terrorist attack, what happens is we pretty much investigate any content that glorifies the attackers. Within Palestinian circles, for instance, handing out candies after a Jew had been killed. That's very common. Now, YouTube promises that they remove, in their policy, that they remove content that glorifies these attacks, terrorist attacks, and terrorism generally. So I flagged this, and I flagged this content and said that the terrorist who carried out the attack is referred to in the content that I flagged, referred to as a hero. He's the national hero, he's the martyr, and they explicitly refused. And that's one of the reasons why the policy really is a sham, because the argument that they presented was mostly around very insignificant elements that have to exist for them to actually take down the content. So, for instance, if you look at a video where this man is being glorified, but the video itself, within the four corners of the video, it doesn't include the logo of a terrorist organization. I mean, that is laughable. If you are effectively trying to promote terrorism, you're not going to include your logo. This isn't some fashion brand. It's terrorist activity. So really, it is a sham. I'll go back to May 2021. So in May 2021, I raised a video where basically the content was saying Al-Qassam, again Hamas's militant arm, terrorizes Jews. That was during the wave of escalations between Israel and the terrorist group Hamas, and the thousands of rockets that were fired. So I flagged this content and said we should flag this to the client. The content basically says Al-Qassam terrorizes Jews. The word terrorizes is precisely and exactly what they use. So clearly that's terrorism. Terrorizes terrorism. That doesn't take a rocket scientist. And I was told that by a colleague, the word Jews is used in the Quran. So this is a religious conversation essentially. So pretty much protections of freedom of expression apply to this content, which was absurd. I raised that with my direct manager and I said, I think we have a blind spot to anti-Semitism. Now, I'm Egyptian, so I come from the Arab world where anti-Semitism is sadly commonplace. It is the norm, not the exception. And there were no safeguards against bias. There were no safeguards against bias whatsoever. And that was it. They said to me, basically, we're not flagging it. And essentially, at some point, because I continued to flag this content and continued to argue against it, and argue for removing it and for flagging it with YouTube, I received, my boss told me that he's placing me on an informal action plan because he needs to make sure that I'm flagging content within the guidelines, the official public guidelines, and the internal guidelines of YouTube, which are extremely contradictory. So they have a list of around 28 or 29, forgive me, of 28 or 29 people that they refer to as globally designated terrorist individuals. Now this list, by the way, does not include one Palestinian terrorist. Not one. Not anyone from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It includes individuals similar to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was pretty much the caliph, Khalifa of the Islamic State, but it does not include anyone from Hamas. He does not include Abu Ubaidah. Abu Ubaidah, for instance, is the man who's always masked. He leads Hamas's militant arm, which is Al-Qassam, Kataib al-Qassam. And he's the one who's always made the threats against Israel, obviously the very horrific anti-Semitic threats and of indiscriminate attacks against Israeli civilians. Now, when you see this, he's not on the list. So any content that glorifies him, if it doesn't have Hamas's logo or Al-Qassam's logo in the video, for instance, they wouldn't take it down because he's not on the list.